Hey there YouTube, Travis here. Well, I'm right in the middle of a Puch ZA50 rebuild. This is my first time rebuilding one of these engines, and boy, this is a real bear. So like all good projects, I've started out with a bike I bought for cheap that was a complete basket case. Another crankshaft, completely frozen. And here is the original bike that came with this motor. Someone put some parts on it. They ordered some treats about maybe 10 plus years ago, but the motor has definitely been stuck for a long time. And yeah, getting it apart was a real learning process, but I've also hit some other snags and wanted to make this little video to talk about that more. So the first snag that I hit was actually upon disassembly. The ZA50, again, I'm coming from the E50 world here. Something unique about these engines is that they actually use a three-piece bearing for the crank bearings. So when we look at a three-piece bearing, here's the original crank, and this bearing cage can actually be popped off. But underneath is the inner diameter of the bearing, which you heat that up, slide that on. And then there's also the outer bearing race. So that's your ball bearing right there. It's different than an E50 bearing. Like this is a bearing that's one piece, which you would find on like an E50 crankshaft. This is actually for the output shaft on the ZA50. But for the crank, they use these three-piece bearings. And man, this outer race, this stays in the cases. We can see I've got my new ones installed already. I was able to just heat, and then these dropped right in. But the old ones, even with heat, they would not come out. These things were stuck in there. Again, this was a really rusted basket case of a motor. Tried heat. There's no really good place to get a screwdriver or a chisel to try and pound this out. Ultimately, what we did was a good friend of mine. He used his blind hole bearing puller. It's a slide hammer style tool. We flipped it upside down, got it in front of this, and then just wailed on it. And this came out, and I was very relieved when it did. You can see I even tried to cut it with a Dremel, but there's no good angle to really get it, and I didn't want to risk gouging the case. So I gave up on that, but the blind hole bearing puller absolutely worked, and we were able to move on. And the next bit of nuance for me was, of course, installing the crankshaft and doing the shimming for it. So I am blessed where I do actually have an OG Puch factory dealer tool here. They actually sell a reproduction of this on treats today, which is excellent. I think it'd be pretty hard to redo one of these engines without a tool like that. The very basic version is obviously we're working with a three-piece bearing here. So this bearing needs to ride pretty true inside the outer diameter there. And you use a series of shims to get the spacing just right. So the way this tool works, and I guess maybe I should explain a little further here, there is transmission shimming also, not that far yet, but just for the crank shimming, you have obviously different size shims for the ignition side and also the transmission side. For me, I ended up using the two smallest shims they sell. It was an ignition side shim of 0.05 millimeters and 0.1 for the transmission side. Again, these shims, they sit in between the lobe of the crank and the inner race of the three-piece bearing. Coming back to the motor here, the way the tool works, I'm working one-handed with the camera here, so I'll have to do some editing here, but the way it works is you start with obviously the outer race already installed of your new bearing. This is the stator side, the ignition side. You take the tool, loosen it up, and you get this adjusted like this to where it's resting on the outer race of the bearing and then the case. And you lock down your depth. So you get that pressed in, lock down your depth. You take it out and you invert it. You go to the clutch side. And this would be before the bearing install happens. So just like an E50, you have to heat up the bearings and drop them on the crank. But before you do that, you measure. Okay, so the clutch transmission side is in. And let's pretend that this bearing isn't here. I don't want to have to pull it for the purpose of making the video, so it's going to stay there because I'm pretty sure I got this shimming right. You take your tool, You go ahead and slide it over the crank, and basically what you'd want is the bottom of the tool to be flush to the crank, and then this to be firm against the gasket, so having the case gasket installed here too. And so this is what my shimming came out to. It sounds like it's really something that you have to check every single time, but now I can proceed and do the assembly. At one point, I actually had the cases assembled, but I had to pull them apart because of an issue with some parts, and I'll explain that now. So up until now, we've been talking about learning curves. I actually hit a snag with this next part of the rebuild. So as I mentioned, the output shaft goes through back here. It actually looks like this, and this would be the equivalent of like on a E50, a main gear, and then the output shaft, the sprocket sits on this, and then your chain goes over top. So this output shaft goes in through here, and it rides on this bearing. There's this little piece that sits on there also. This gets kind of pressed in to the seal. And then there's the seal. Now, all the seals for this, I believe, the crank seals, the stator side seal, and the output shaft seal all have an outer diameter of 35. So fit great. Unfortunately, the inner diameter of this is only 20 millimeters. And, I was able to press this in and then have the output shaft in there. But unfortunately, when I assembled the entire motor, the output shaft didn't turn. And that's because the seal is the wrong seal. 20 millimeters is too small. The seal that I took out looks like this for comparison. So that's the original seal, which you could reuse. This is not a pressurized part of the crankcase. This is just holding back transmission oil. But unfortunately, this seal is completely torn. So yeah, can't reuse that. You can see it better there. So I went ahead and, with no time to spare, had Amazon send one that is 25 millimeter inner diameter and is a identical match for this one. So this should all go back together. These things happen sometimes when you do a rebuild. You just kind of got to roll with the punches and learn to enjoy the process. And of course, because this was a complete basket case rebuild, I did the shift pucks. These are in terrible shape. There's really not much left of them at all. I had a Puch ZA about 10 years ago, if you remember following and seeing that on this channel. The shift pucks in that looked like they were in decent-ish shape, but who knows how those would have held up if you actually ran it. This stuff is well over 40 years old at this point. So these pucks were obviously destroyed. Your shift pucks live in here under these flathead screws. And I replaced these ones with some shift pucks from Serious Blasters Only. Jesse puts those together over there, and I'm looking forward to seeing how those hold up. They're gumdrop style. There's also, of course, the other ones they sell on the websites, but nice opportunity to try out a new product. And I'm really excited because this build, finally doing something I've wanted to do for a long time, which is build a nice Polini Puch. So I have a brand new Polini 64 kit here. We're gonna do this thing like 2006 style. So we're gonna keep it a pretty mild Polini build. We're gonna run the 15 Bing. We're gonna run a mild pipe. And it's not gonna destroy clutches, but hopefully we make lots of good power and get to enjoy it for an all-around bike. But yes, this will be a Polini ZA, and I cannot wait to get this buttoned up. It's just been a lot of learning, which I knew it would be. And there are certainly a lot more pieces to this than an E50, but I've been going slow and I've been enjoying it. There's a lot of really good ZA50 videos that are already out there. Detroit Moped Works has some really good ones where they talk about everything from shimming to the transmission teardown. It's really quite nice. So again, mopeds, they're definitely supposed to be fun. I don't feel anywhere near confident enough to do a formal video on rebuilding one of these guys, But I just wanted to document this process here and kind of show you some of my gotchas in case you decide to tackle a rebuild of one of these engines on your own. One more thing, it's definitely tempting to put this motor back on the bike it came from, that green Puch Maxi frame, but I also recently acquired this Puch Free Spirit, which is a full rigid model. So this would have been one of the cheapest bikes you could buy back in the day. Obviously, yes, rigid rear suspension, just like a Puch Maxi N, but also one solid piece these forks are. Oh boy. We'll see. I've got other motors, other E50s that could go on this, but man, I'm just really amused by the idea of the cheapest frame with the most plush motor on it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this little dive into this motor with me. It's certainly been a lot of fun so far, even if it's been frustrating at times. I'm hoping I'll be able to update this channel soon once this is back together with all the other stuff I'm sure that I'll learn. Okay, YouTube, until next time.